Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere far more dangerous than any battlefield or plague-ridden medieval village. We're going somewhere with wall-to-wall carpeting, a casserole in the oven, and a prescription bottle on the kitchen counter that rattles like a maraca every time someone opens the cabinet. Tonight, we're stepping inside the life of the 1970s suburban housewife, specifically the kind who kept the house spotless, the children quiet, the husband's dinner warm, and a very generous daily relationship with something called a Quaalude. Not a pirate, not a peasant. A woman in a floral housecoat and sensible slippers who somehow managed to be both the most invisible and the most chemically interesting person on the block. Now, before you get comfortable, and trust me, you're going to want to get very comfortable for this one, go ahead and take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I put together here. No pressure, no guilt, no passive-aggressive sighing in your direction. And a huge, genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are. The fact that you thought of this, typed it out, and sent it in says a lot about you, and I mean that in the best possible way. This channel only keeps growing because of suggestions like yours, and it genuinely means the world. If you haven't already, check us out on Spotify too, the link is in the description. Perfect for falling asleep mid-commute and waking up deeply confused about what decade you're in. Now. Dim those lights, pull the blanket up, maybe click on a fan for that soft low hum. You know, the one that sounds vaguely like a 1973 clothes dryer running a full load of polyester. Get yourself horizontal. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a housewife in the suburbs in the 1970s? What exactly was in that casserole, and did anyone ever actually enjoy it? Was the smile real, or was it pharmaceutical? What did it feel like to spend your entire day managing a household that absolutely no one acknowledged as work? Did your husband come home, look at the spotless kitchen, the fed children, the ironed shirts, and say literally anything? Or did he sit down, open a beer, and turn on the news like you'd just been sitting there doing a crossword all afternoon? How many Quaaludes did it take to get through a Tuesday? Was it more on days when the kids were home, or less, because at least then there was someone to talk to? What happened when the doctor kept refilling that prescription and the pharmacist started recognizing your voice on the phone? Did anyone notice? Did anyone ask? And if they did you just smile and offer them a tuna noodle casserole? Congratulations, you have just woken up in 1973. You're in a split-level ranch home somewhere in a suburb that has 3 different streets, all named after trees that were cut down to build it. The carpet is harvest gold. The appliances are avocado green. There's a jello mold in the refrigerator that nobody asked for. Your husband left 45 minutes ago. The kids are at school. The house is quiet. And somewhere in the kitchen cabinet, behind the good china that only comes out for company, is a little brown prescription bottle with your name on it. Good morning. This is your life now. Let's talk about waking up. Not the gentle, Instagram-filtered waking up of modern wellness culture. No golden light, no mindfulness app, no lemon water with chia seeds. This is 1973 waking up, which means the alarm goes off at 6:15, your husband is already in the shower, and before you've even fully registered that you're conscious, you're already behind. The mental to-do list assembles itself before your feet hit the floor. Lunches, permission slips, the dry cleaning that needs to go back, the casserole for the Hendersons next door because Margaret just had her gallbladder out. And somewhere underneath all of that, quiet, patient, rattling softly, is the thought of that little brown bottle in the kitchen cabinet. But first, coffee. Always first, coffee. The house itself is the 1970s dream made physical. Split-level ranch, which sounds architectural and impressive until you realise it just means there are 3 steps down into the living room that you will stub your toe on approximately 400 times a year. The carpet is harvest gold, a colour that exists nowhere in nature, but somehow ended up on 30% of American floors in this decade. The kitchen is avocado green. The appliances, the backsplash tile, the ceramic rooster on the counter that serves no purpose anyone can identify, but has lived on that counter for 6 years and cannot be moved because it was a gift from your mother-in-law. There is a texture on the ceiling that is called popcorn, as if the ceiling tried to become a snack and gave up halfway through. This is your domain. All of it, every harvest gold square inch of it, is yours to manage. The morning routine is a feat of logistics that would impress a military strategist. Breakfast for 3 children who all have different opinions about eggs, lunches packed in brown paper bags, peanut butter on white bread, an apple, a handful of chips, a small note inside if the morning is going well enough to write one, and most mornings it is not. Permission slips located, signed, returned to backpacks. The 7-year-old cannot find her left shoe. The 5-year-old has decided this morning, specifically, is the morning he refuses to wear pants. The 2-year-old is simply screaming, as is her primary contribution to any situation. You navigate all of this while your husband finishes his coffee, reads the paper and says, "Sounds like a handful," which is technically accurate and also, in this moment, genuinely not helpful. And here is what nobody tells you, the thing they left out of every magazine and every advertisement and every cheerful television commercial, featuring a woman delighted by her dishwasher. The work never ends. There is no clocking out. There is no commute home that signals the transition between work you and not work you. The house is the job and the job is the house, and the house is always there. Even when you sit down, you're sitting inside the job. You're surrounded by surfaces that need wiping, laundry that needs folding, a refrigerator that needs organizing, a child who needs something. Modern life calls this being always on. In 1973, it didn't have a name. It was just Tuesday. By 8:15, the children are at school, and the husband is at work, and the door is closed, and the house is quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. These are different things. Peace implies rest. This quiet just means the noise is relocated temporarily. You stand at the kitchen counter, coffee in hand, looking at the breakfast dishes in the sink, the crumbs on the table, the small shoe that turned up after the bus left, and you make a simple calculation about the day ahead that has become as automatic as breathing. You open the cabinet. Behind the good china, the brown bottle, the small white pill placed on your tongue with the mechanical ease of long habit, washed down with the last of your coffee, and you begin again. Let's talk about how this all began, because nobody woke up one morning and decided to become chemically dependent on a sedative. It started with a doctor. Specifically, it started with a doctor who looked at a tired, anxious woman sitting across from him, describing what today we'd immediately recognize as burnout, depression, and chronic stress, and handed her a prescription in about 4 minutes flat. The drug was methaqualone, sold most commonly under the brand name Quaalude, and in the early 1970s it was handed out like breath mints. Doctors called them a safer alternative to barbiturates. Patients called them the thing that finally made the afternoons feel survivable, and for a generation of suburban housewives quietly drowning in domesticity, they were, for a while, something close to a miracle. The first appointment was probably not dramatic. You went because you hadn't been sleeping, or because you'd been crying more than seemed reasonable, and you couldn't explain exactly why, which was its own kind of distressing, or because your husband mentioned, gently, carefully, in the way husbands in 1973 mentioned things, that you seemed a little wound up lately. The doctor's office was clean and quiet in a way your house never was. The doctor himself, and it was almost always a him, was reassuring in the specific way of men who are used to being reassuring to women. He asked a few questions. He nodded. He said something like, "It sounds like your nerves are a little frayed," which was the medical establishment's way of describing a complete, Systemic collapse without anyone having to use dramatic language. What he did not ask was, what does your day actually look like? How many hours are you working? Does anyone help you? Does your husband know how exhausted you are? Do you have anything that belongs only to you? These questions did not occur to him, not because he was a bad man, but because in 1973 the answers were simply assumed. Of course she's doing all of it. Of course nobody's helping. That's what women do. The issue is her nervous system, not her circumstances. The fix, therefore, is chemical. Methaqualone had been around since the 1950s, originally developed in India as an anti-malarial medication, which didn't work, but it did sedate people very effectively, so researchers pivoted. By the early 60s, it was being prescribed in Europe as a sleeping aid, marketed as non-addictive, which turned out to be enthusiastically incorrect. By the time it reached American pharmacies under the Quaalude label, it had acquired something of a reputation, among doctors for its calming effects, among patients for the particular warmth it produced, and among researchers who were just beginning to notice quietly that people were having a very hard time stopping. But none of that made it into the doctor's office on that first visit. What made it in was a prescription pad and a reassuring nod, and the phrase, "Let's just try these for a few weeks and see how you feel." A few weeks. As if anything involving the human nervous system operates on the timeline of a few weeks. The prescription was 30 pills. You took them as directed. After 4 days, you felt for the first time in what felt like years, like the volume on everything had been turned down to a manageable level. The anxiety was still there, but it was further away, like hearing thunder from inside a well-insulated house. Present, unthreatening, yours to ignore. At the end of the month you went back. He asked how you were, sleeping. You said much better. He refilled the prescription, and just like that, without ceremony or warning, without anyone saying the word addiction, or the word dependency, or the word this is going to become a problem, a routine was established. One that would last, quietly and completely, for years. Let's actually talk about the drug, because if you're going to spend a whole night inside this life, you should probably understand what was running the show. Methaqualone, Quaalude, Sopor, Lemon 714, depending on who you were talking to and how dramatic you wanted to sound, was a sedative hypnotic drug developed in the 1950s, originally intended to be a safer sleeping pill. By the time the 1970s rolled around, it had found a second life as both a prescription medication and, increasingly, a recreational drug. For the housewife, it wasn't recreational, it was medicinal, it was maintenance. A small white pill that took the jagged edges of the day and sanded them down into something smooth, manageable, almost pleasant, like wrapping your entire nervous system in a warm bath towel. The drug worked on the brain's GABA receptors, the same system targeted by alcohol and later by benzodiazepines like Valium. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, essentially the chemical that tells everything to calm down. Methaqualone flooded that system. Inhibitions lowered, anxiety receded, muscles relaxed. The persistent low-grade tension that had become so much a part of daily life that you'd stopped recognizing it as tension simply, softened, not disappeared, softened, which, if you've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, can feel like the same thing. At a low dose, and the prescription doses were relatively low, at first, the effect was described by users as a warm, pleasant heaviness, alert enough to function, calm enough to not be destroyed by the functioning. You could make lunch, you could answer the phone, you could smile at the neighbour who stopped by unannounced and not feel the specific vibrating irritation that unannounced visitors had been producing in you for years. The drug didn't make you happy exactly. It made you less reactive, less raw, less present in the particular way that full presence had become painful. The problem, and there was always going to be a problem, was tolerance. The human brain is an adaptation machine. Flood its GABA receptors long enough, and it begins to compensate, producing less natural GABA, adjusting its baseline to account for the drug's presence, which means the dose that worked in month 1 does less in month 3, and less still by month 6. And here is the trap, the specific and elegant trap of sedative dependence. The anxiety you feel when the drug is wearing off is worse than the anxiety you started with. Your nervous system, recalibrated around the drug's presence, reads its absence as emergency. So you take another pill, not to get calm, but to get back to baseline. The relief that felt like a gift in the beginning has become the rent you pay just to feel normal. And at higher doses, which came as tolerance built, because the lower doses simply stopped being enough, methaqualone produced something more than calm. Slurred speech, impaired coordination, a dreamlike quality to ordinary moments, pleasant until it wasn't, peaceful until it became something closer to lost. The body could be in the kitchen making dinner while the mind was somewhere considerably further away, watching from a comfortable distance, uninvested. This was not a side effect anyone had warned you about, and when it appeared gradually enough that there was no single moment of recognition, just a slow, gentle drift from taking something to help to being somewhere that help couldn't reach you. Let's talk about your husband. He's a good man, probably. He works hard, brings home a paycheck, doesn't raise his voice, at least not often. He also has approximately zero awareness of what your day looks like. He leaves at 8. He returns at 6. In between, he has lunch at a restaurant with colleagues, drinks coffee that someone else made, uses a bathroom that someone else cleans. He has a secretary who manages his calendar. You manage everything else, the children, the house, the social obligations, the emotional labor of every relationship in his life. And when he walks through the door at 6, he might pat you on the shoulder and ask what's for dinner. And somehow, this is the arrangement that 1973 considers perfectly normal. Your husband is not a villain. This is important to understand because the story of the 1970s housewife is not primarily a story about villainous husbands. It's a story about a structure so normalized, so embedded in the fabric of daily life, that the people inside it couldn't see its shape. He genuinely does not know how long it took to make dinner. He has never thought about it. He grew up in a house where dinner appeared, and now he lives in a house where dinner appears, and the machinery that produces dinner is as invisible to him as the plumbing in the walls. He would be startled to learn how much of his life is being managed by someone he hasn't thought to ask about since Tuesday. He has his own pressures. The job is real, the commute is real, the performance reviews and office politics and the grinding sameness of returning to the same building every day are real. He comes home tired, genuinely tired, and what he finds at home is everything handled. The children bathed, dinner ready. The house quiet in a way it probably wasn't 3 hours ago, though he has no way of knowing that. It looks like peace. It is in fact peace that someone built for him at considerable personal cost, but he has no framework for understanding it that way. He sits in his chair. He opens the newspaper. He is, as far as he can tell, doing his part. The 3-martini lunch is not a myth. It is a cultural institution of the 1970s business world, expensed, expected, considered part of the professional landscape in a way that nobody questions. Your husband comes home 2 or 3 evenings a week with the particular looseness of a man who has had drinks at lunch and possibly 1 or 2 more with a colleague at 5:30. Nobody calls this a dependency. Nobody schedules a doctor's appointment. Nobody writes a magazine article about the crisis of the drinking businessman. It is simply what men do. The different standard does not escape you. though you have learned not to name it out loud. What he notices, or rather, what he doesn't notice, is the pill. Not at first. The change in you is so gradual, so carefully managed, that there is no single afternoon where you're visibly different. You're slower, sometimes, in the evenings. Your words occasionally arrive with a slight delay, like a phone call with a bad connection. Once or twice he has come home to find you asleep on the couch at 5, dinner not started, the 2-year-old watching television in her pyjamas. But there is always an explanation. A migraine, a rough night with the baby, a headache that knocked you sideways. He accepts these explanations not because he is foolish, but because the alternative, looking at them closely enough to doubt them, would require a conversation that neither of you has the language for yet. Let's talk about the kids. You love them. This is not in question. You love them the way you love breathing, completely, automatically, without thinking about it. But you're also alone with them all day, every day, in a house that has no yard big enough to lose them in, with no other adult within earshot and no concept yet that motherhood being hard does not make you a bad mother. There is a 2-year-old who has opinions about her sandwiches. There is a 5-year-old who has just discovered the word why and is deploying it, like a weapon. And there is a 7-year-old who needs to be somewhere at 3:15, somewhere else at 4 and back home by 5, which means you are a taxi service that also does laundry. The 2-year-old is the most honest person in the house. She wants what she wants, she screams when she doesn't get it, and she has no interest in social convention whatsoever. She will throw a full cup of apple juice on the clean floor with the serenity of someone releasing a balloon. She will require a complete outfit change 4 times before noon. She will take a nap at 11, which sounds like relief until you discover the nap lasts 22 minutes, and she wakes up angrier than when she went down, as if sleep has only clarified her grievances. You love her so ferociously it is almost frightening. You're also, by 11:30 on any given morning, genuinely considering moving to another country. The 5-year-old has entered the philosophical phase of childhood. Everything is a question. Why is the sky blue? Why do we have to eat dinner? Why does Tommy at school get to have a dog and we don't? Why does Dad get to sleep late on Saturdays? This last one you answer with something vague about how Dad works very hard, which is true, and you file the follow-up thought, and so do I, in the drawer where you file most of your follow-up thoughts. You answer the questions because he is 5 and curious, and this is what 5 looks like, and you want to be the kind of mother who encourages curiosity. But by the 40th why of the day, you are answering from a place that requires more patience than feels biologically possible. The 7-year-old is starting to see things. This is the one that sits with you quietly sometimes. Children at 7 are just old enough to notice the patterns of the adults around them, to register the texture of the afternoon, to understand that mommy being tired is a different kind of tired some days than others. She has not said anything. She won't. For a long time, perhaps ever, children absorb what they observe and carry it without a label. But she watches, and you feel watched, in that particular way that a 7-year-old's attention lands, which is without judgment but also without mercy. What the research that doesn't exist yet in 1973 but will eventually confirm is that the experience of motherhood in this era was among the loneliest social conditions studied. Full-time homemakers reported higher rates of depression than their employed counterparts, not because motherhood is inherently miserable, but because isolation is. Because doing important work that nobody sees or values or relieves you from is genuinely, documentably, psychologically damaging. The children are not the problem. The children are the great, exhausting, irreplaceable love of this life. The problem is that you're doing it entirely alone, inside a structure that will not admit that this is a problem, with the assistance of a small white pill that is doing its level best but was never designed for this job. Let's talk about where you live, because the setting matters. The suburb is a masterpiece of mid-century optimism and mid-century denial. Wide streets, matching mailboxes, lawns that need mowing at exactly the same rate because they were all laid with the same sod in 1968. Every house has a picture window in the front that lets in natural light and also lets the neighbours see directly into your living room, which means your living room must always look like the living room. The suburb sold itself as the dream, the escape from the city, the space for children to grow, the quiet. What they didn't put in the brochure was that quiet, when you're alone in it, is a very different thing from peace. The suburb was built around a specific assumption that one person would be in every house during the day. That person was you. The men commuted, the children went to school, and a street full of houses sat in the mid-morning light, occupied by women who were each separately alone in them. You could see the other houses from your kitchen window while you did the dishes, identical siding, identical driveways, identical picture windows looking back at you. Behind each one, a version of your life, and a woman managing it with varying degrees of success and varying pharmaceutical assistance, though nobody was comparing notes at the level of honesty that would have required. The distances in a suburb are deceptive. You're surrounded by neighbours, 10 feet from their driveway, 30 feet from their front door. And yet the design of the suburb is profoundly isolating. There are no natural gathering places, no stoops where you linger, no markets where you walk and run into people. Everything requires a car. The grocery store is a 12-minute drive. The library is in the next town over. Your mother is an hour away and calling long distance before 7 in the evening costs money you think about spending. The suburb connects you to everyone and nobody simultaneously, which is a very specific kind of loneliness, the kind that's hard to name because you're never technically alone. The station wagon is the other room of your house, the room that moves. You spend more time in the car than you would ever have predicted when you got married. School runs, grocery runs, doctor appointments, piano lessons, the dry cleaner, the hardware store. The children fight in the back seat. The radio plays something by the Carpenters and then something by Elton John, and there are 3 minutes sometimes on the highway between the piano teacher's house and the grocery store when the children are briefly quiet and the sun is coming through the windshield at a particular angle, and you feel something that is almost like yourself. Then someone kicks someone in the back seat, and you turn into the parking lot, and it begins again. The suburb also has a social hierarchy as complex as any medieval court. It's just upholstered. Who has the nicest lawn? Who brings what to the neighbourhood potluck? Whose children are best behaved? Whose husband got promoted? Whose house got a new addition last summer? You learn to navigate this with the fluency of someone who has been studying it for years, which you have, because the suburb is its own institution with its own rules, and breaking them has consequences that are social rather than legal, but feel nearly as serious. You smile at the right moments, you bring the right dish. You do not, under any circumstances, let anyone see what the inside of the cabinet looks like. Let's talk about the medical system, because understanding how a generation of women ended up reliant on sedatives requires understanding who was prescribing them and why. In the 1960s and 70s, the medical establishment had a particular way of interpreting women's distress. Anxiety, exhaustion, tearfulness, difficulty, coping, these were not seen as appropriate responses to genuinely difficult circumstances. They were seen as symptoms of a fragile female nervous system that simply needed chemical stabilization. The diagnosis was often something like nervous exhaustion or anxiety neurosis, phrases that put the problem inside the woman's body and kept it there, neatly, away from the question of what might be causing it. The treatment was a prescription. The follow-up was another prescription. The doctor you see is not a bad doctor by the standards of his time. He trained at a good medical school. He has been practicing for 15 years. He genuinely wants his patients to feel better, in the way that a person who has not thought very carefully about the structure producing their patient's symptoms genuinely wants to address the symptoms. He sees a lot of housewives. They come in tired, anxious, weepy, overwhelmed. He gives them something to take the edge off. They come back in a month, improved. He refills. This is, in his experience, what successful treatment looks like. What he does not know, or does not apply to this context, is that methaqualone produces physical dependence within weeks of regular use. This was known, or at least suspected by researchers by the early 1970s. The drug companies had presented data suggesting the addiction potential was low, and the FDA had accepted this with the particular credulity that the FDA extended to pharmaceutical companies in this era, which is to say, fairly credulously. By the time the evidence of widespread dependence was undeniable, millions of prescriptions had been written, and the damage was already comprehensively done. The monthly appointment becomes a ritual, 8 minutes maximum. He asks if you're sleeping. You say yes mostly. He asks if the anxiety is better. You say much better, thank you. There is a moment sometimes at the end of the appointment when he might almost ask something more probing. You can see it in his face, a slight hesitation, a consideration, and then he picks up his pen and writes the prescription, and the moment passes. He is busy. There are patients waiting. You seem fine, all things considered. You always seem fine. This is one of your great achievements and your great undoings. You seem so consistently, convincingly fine. By the mid-1970s, the prescription volume for sedative hypnotics in the United States had reached numbers that would later be described by public health researchers as staggering. Valium alone was the most prescribed drug in the country for several consecutive years. Quaalude prescriptions numbered in the tens of millions. The patients, disproportionately, were women. Nobody in the medical establishment paused to ask whether prescribing sedatives to women at twice the rate of men, specifically in the context of domestic roles, might be treating the symptoms of a social problem with a pharmaceutical solution. That question would come later, asked loudly by women who had survived the treatment. But in 1973, in your doctor's office, all that happened was the scratch of a pen and a small square of paper that kept the machinery of your life moving for another month. Let's talk about the routine, because there is always a routine. The alarm, the husband, the breakfast, the school lunches assembled on the counter, like a small joyless conveyor belt, peanut butter on white bread, an apple, a bag of chips, a note inside if you're having a good enough morning to write one, and most mornings it is not. The kids out the door, the husband out the door closing, and then the particular quality of silence that fills the house at 8:15 on a Tuesday. That silence that isn't peaceful, exactly, but is at least yours. The pill, taken with the second cup of coffee. The slight warm softening that arrives about 20 minutes later. And the morning beginning to feel, if not manageable exactly, then at least like something you might get through. The routine exists because routine is the architecture of the housewife's life. Without it, there is nothing to mark one day from the next, no distinction between a Monday and a Thursday, except which child has which activity and whether the garbage needs to go out. The routine is the container. The routine is also, after enough years, the cage. Modern productivity culture has rehabilitated the word routine, given it a glow-up, surrounded it with wellness language about morning pages and cold plunges and intentional living. This is not that routine. This is a routine built entirely around the needs of other people, timed to their schedules, structured by their requirements, leaving the gaps, the 20 minutes after the lunches are made, the hour before the school run, the drift of the afternoon, for you. Except the gaps are also full. The gaps are laundry and vacuuming and that phone call you've been putting off to your mother-in-law. The pill fits into the routine so smoothly that it stops feeling like a decision. It becomes part of the sequence, like coffee. Alarm, husband, breakfast, lunches, door, coffee, pill. You don't deliberate. You don't negotiate with yourself. The bottle is in the cabinet behind the china, and you open the cabinet and take one, and that is simply what happens at 8:15 in the morning. The pharmacological effect is consistent and reliable in a way that very little in the morning routine is. The casserole might not turn out, the 7-year-old might miss the bus, the 2-year-old will certainly do something that requires paper towels, but the pill will arrive at 8:35, approximately, with its soft, predictable warmth, and the day will settle into something that can be managed. What the routine obscures is change, because the routine stays the same while the pill's effect gradually shifts. The dose that worked 6 months ago doing less now, the window of relief shorter, the return of the undrugged self more jagged than before. But routines are good at hiding gradual change. You don't notice the water getting warmer if you've been in the pot long enough. The morning looks the same, the pill is taken, the day proceeds. It is only in retrospect, months, years later, looking back, that the drift becomes visible, the way you can only see how far a ship has moved from shore once you're already far enough out to see the shore at all. Let's talk about housework, because the house does not clean itself. This is actually the central joke of the housewife's life. The cleaner the house, the more invisible the work. Nobody notices a spotless kitchen. Nobody comes home and says, "I see you have once again defeated entropy." They notice when things are wrong. The dish in the sink, the ring around the bathtub, the fingerprints on the sliding glass door that the children regenerate faster than you can remove them. You're fighting a war with no victory, condition, against an enemy that simply keeps coming back, and you're doing it every day on a timeline set by someone else, with no co-worker, no supervisor, no performance review, and no paycheck. The floors alone are a philosophical exercise in futility. The harvest gold carpet runs through the living room and the hallways and catches everything, every crumb, every tracked-in piece of mud, every crayon that got dragged under the couch by the 2-year-old. The vacuum cleaner is a Hoover upright that is heavier than it has any right to be, and vacuuming the downstairs takes 35 minutes and leaves satisfying tracks in the pile that will be destroyed within the hour by the 5-year-old running through in his socks. The kitchen linoleum can be mopped on Monday and look like it was never mopped by Wednesday afternoon, which is a clock you could set your life by, and in a sense you have. The bathroom. Let's talk about the bathroom, because the bathroom is a particular kind of test. There are 3 children and a husband who use this bathroom and approximately 1 person who cleans it, and that person is you. The ring around the bathtub arrives with the reliable confidence of a season. The sink requires attention every 2 days. The toilet is a situation that you have, over the years, developed a very specific and very tired emotional relationship with. You clean it again. You think about the fact that you are cleaning it again. You do not think about it too long, because too long leads somewhere uncomfortable. Women in the 1970s spent an average of 8 hours a day on domestic work. 8 hours. The same amount of time as a full work day. Except without breaks, without colleagues, without a paycheck, without recognition, and without the ability to leave the office. The feminist economists who would later attempt to calculate the monetary value of this labour, the cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, the household, management arrived at figures that would have rewritten the economic history of the post-war period had anyone been paying attention. Nobody was paying attention. The work was invisible because the women doing it were invisible, at least in the ways that 1973 used to calculate value. The house was clean. Dinner was ready. Everything was fine. Nobody asked how. Let's talk about dinner, or more specifically, let's talk about the architecture of a 1970s meal. The casserole is the foundational unit of suburban cooking in this era. a category of dish defined mainly by the fact that everything goes in one pan and gets covered in something creamy and then baked until there are no more questions. Cream of mushroom soup is involved in nearly everything. Velveeta has opinions. There is a Jell-O salad that technically counts as a side dish, containing things that should not be in Jell-O: shredded carrots, mini marshmallows, canned fruit suspended in lime gelatin, like something preserved for scientific study. You're making this from scratch, every night, for a family that will eat it in 11 minutes without looking up from their plates. The 1970s kitchen is a particular environment. The avocado green refrigerator hums with the low frequency of an appliance that is alive in the way appliances of this era were alive: loud, persistent, and extremely difficult to kill. The countertops are formica in a pattern that was described in the showroom as harvest wheat and looks, in the kitchen light, like the surface of a very tired planet. There is a spice rack on the wall that contains garlic salt, paprika, something called mixed herbs that has been there since you moved in, and a jar of onion powder that is, if you're honest, more sentiment than seasoning at this point. Dinner planning in 1973 is an act of mental labour that begins long before dinner. You plan the week, cross-referencing what's in the pantry against what the family will eat, against what's on sale at the grocery store, against the fact that Tuesdays are busy because of the 5-year-old's Cub Scouts, and dinner needs to be ready early. The Good Housekeeping cookbook is on the counter, spine cracked from use, certain pages bearing the evidence of past cooking and their stains. You know the recipes by heart. You make them anyway, because improvising is exhausting, and the casserole on page 212 has never failed you. And in a life that offers limited guarantees, a reliable casserole is not nothing. The meal is served at 6 when the husband returns. You have fed the 2-year-old already because the 2-year-old cannot be expected to wait until 6 without achieving a level of distress that affects everyone in a 3-house radius. The older children sit at the table. Your husband sits at the table. You serve. You sit. The meal is eaten with the specific speed of a family that is hungry and not particularly interested in the meal as a social occasion. The 5-year-old doesn't like what's in the casserole tonight. You tell him to eat it anyway. He eats it, eventually, with the expression of someone undergoing a minor medical procedure. Your husband has seconds. He does not say it's good, which means it is, because the only time your husband comments on dinner is when something is wrong with it. You clear the table, you wash the dishes, and somewhere around 8 o'clock, when the children are in bed and the kitchen is clean and the house is quiet again, you sit down for the first time since morning and feel, distantly, the end of the day arriving like a tide going out. Let's talk about the women on the street, because you are not entirely alone. There are the neighbours. There is Carol from 3 doors down who comes over for coffee on Wednesdays and talks at a speed that suggests she too has taken something. There is Diane, who is on the PTA and has a look of controlled desperation that you recognise immediately because you see it in the mirror. There are the lunches, the coffee clatches, the afternoons on someone's patio with a tab soda, and a shared, unspoken understanding that nobody is going to ask too many direct questions. Friendship in the 1970s suburb is a beautiful, tender, deeply coded thing, full of warmth and completely devoid of the vocabulary that would let anyone say exactly what was wrong. Carol is your closest friend in the neighbourhood, which means you know what she orders at the diner, you know her mother-in-law is a problem, and you know she cried in her car in the grocery store parking lot last March, though neither of you has ever mentioned it. This is the language of suburban female friendship. Proximity without full disclosure, warmth without exposure, 1,000 shared cups of coffee and not one single honest conversation about whether either of you is doing all right. It is not dishonesty. It is protection. You protect each other by not asking, what would happen if you did? The Wednesday coffee is a ritual with the weight of institution. You sit at someone's kitchen table, rotating houses, though Carol's is the most frequent. because Carol has the nicest coffee maker and the best store-bought coffee cake, and nobody comments on the store-bought because the agreement, unspoken, is that we are all doing our best here. You talk about the children, you talk about the neighbourhood, you talk about the school, the teachers, the upcoming bake sale, what Marcia down the street did at the last block party that nobody can quite forgive. You talk about your husbands with an affectionate exasperation that is also, underneath, a form of solidarity. Nobody says, I am not happy. Nobody says, I feel like I'm disappearing. What they say is, oh, you know how they are, and everyone nods, and there is in that nod a whole library of things that will never be said. Diane is different, sharper, more brittle, the kind of woman who organises the PTA with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb because the PTA is the only thing in her life that has a beginning, a middle, and a clearly defined outcome. She is good at it. She is very, very good at it. And when you see her at the school at pickup moving through the parking lot with her clipboard and her bright smile, you feel for her something that is not quite pity and not quite recognition, but lives exactly between the two. The suburb is full of women like Diane, women who are enormously capable, doing work that is far beneath their capacity, and managing the gap between what they could do and what they're doing with a ferocity that looks, from the outside, like enthusiasm. What the research on women's friendship in this era will later confirm is what you could have told any researcher at any point. These friendships were survival mechanisms. The coffee on Wednesdays, the phone calls in the afternoon when the children were napping, the brief over-the-fence conversations while pretending to check the mail, these were the connective tissue holding women upright inside a structure that offered them very little other support. They weren't trivial, they were essential. And the fact that they couldn't go quite as deep as the circumstances required, couldn't name the depression, couldn't name the pills, couldn't say I am not okay, was not a failure of the women involved. It was a failure of the language available to them. Nobody had given them the words yet, so they did what they could with what they had. They showed up on Wednesday, and they made the coffee, and they sat together, and that was enough to get through another week. Let's talk about the magazines, because they are everywhere, and they are doing a great deal of damage very quietly. Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, Better Homes and Gardens, every single one featuring a woman on the cover who appears to be genuinely thrilled about the contents of her refrigerator. Inside, recipes for things you do not have time to make, decorating tips for a house you cannot afford to redecorate, and advice columns addressing problems with a relentless cheerfulness that borders on clinical. Feeling overwhelmed? Try organising your linen closet. There is also, buried in the back, a perfume advertisement featuring a woman draped over a sports car in a way that makes you feel, somehow, that you're doing both womanhood and sports cars wrong. The magazines arrive in the mail on their various schedules, and you read them with a complicated feeling that is part aspiration, part accusation, and part something that might be grief if you looked at it directly. The recipes require ingredients that are not in your pantry, and techniques that assume you have a free afternoon, and a sense of adventure about dinner. The decorating spreads show living rooms that look nothing like your living room, which has the crayon mark on the baseboard from the incident of last February and the armchair that needs reupholstering and the coffee table that someone has written their name on in permanent marker, and you don't know who because all 3 children denied it with equal conviction. The advice columns are a particular kind of time capsule. My husband doesn't seem interested in my day. How can I make dinner conversation more engaging? The answer involves becoming a better conversationalist, asking more interesting questions, taking an interest in his work. Not once does the column suggest that perhaps the husband could take an interest in your day, which went as follows. You cleaned a bathroom, made 3 meals, drove 40 minutes in total for school-related logistics, negotiated a standoff between the 5-year-old and a grilled cheese sandwich, and discovered that the 2-year-old had put an entire bar of soap in the toilet. but sure, more engaging dinner conversation. On it. And then there is the other kind of magazine, the one that is starting to creep into the suburban consciousness, with the specific energy of something being let through a side door. Ms. Magazine launched in 1972. Gloria Steinem on the cover. Articles about women's liberation, reproductive rights, equal pay. You have read it. You have read it in the car in the parking lot of the grocery store and then put it in the bottom of your bag before walking inside. The way you'd carry a slightly illicit thing, which in this suburb it practically is. Because the suburb is not, on balance, a hotbed of feminist sympathy. The suburb has a lot invested in the arrangement as it currently stands, and a magazine suggesting that the arrangement might be reconsidered is not, in every kitchen, on every street, welcome. What these magazines collectively represent, both the Good Housekeeping variety and the Ms. variety, is the hinge moment of a decade. Two completely different visions of what a woman's life could look like, arriving in the same mailbox in the same suburb in the same decade. One saying, here is how to be better at what you already are. The other saying, what if you didn't have to be this at all? And you, standing in your Harvest Gold kitchen with a cup of coffee and a pill dissolving quietly in your system, somewhere between those two visions, not entirely one thing or the other, trying to figure out which page you're even on. Let's talk about the afternoons, because the afternoons are when everything gets very quiet and very long. The children are at school, the husband is at work, the cleaning is done, or done enough. The casserole is assembled in the refrigerator waiting, the washing machine is running. And there are 3 hours in the middle of the day that belong entirely to you, in theory. In practice, they're too short to do anything meaningful and too long to simply exist in without the mind beginning to spiral. Soap operas on the television, which are actually quite useful because they remind you that everyone's life is a disaster, yours just doesn't have a dramatic soundtrack. The afternoon is when the pill that was taken at breakfast begins to wear thin, and the question of whether to take another becomes its own small daily negotiation. The afternoon light in a 1970s suburb has a particular quality. It comes through the picture window in the living room at an angle that makes the carpet look almost beautiful, the harvest gold brightening briefly into something that could pass for warmth. You might sit in the armchair for a few minutes, the one that needs reupholstering, and feel the specific luxury of sitting down in a house that is, for these few hours, not demanding anything of you. The washing machine is running. The casserole is ready. The children are someone else's problem until 3:15. This is the closest you come on most days to rest. But the mind, given space, fills it. The afternoons are when the thoughts you've been too busy to think arrive with their full weight. Financial worries. The mortgage went up. The grocery bill is higher than last month. The car needs something the mechanic has described with a cheerfulness that suggests it will be expensive. Worries about the children, specifically the 7-year-old, who has been quiet in a way that isn't quite right. Worries about your marriage, which is fine, you keep telling yourself, fine, in the way that a car is fine when you don't open the hood. And underneath all of it, quieter and more persistent than any specific worry, the question that the afternoon brings most reliably. Is this it? The second pill is a negotiation you have with yourself most days between 1 and 2 in the afternoon. The first one is wearing off. Not dramatically, you don't crash, exactly. It's more that the softness recedes and the edges return, and the edges have gotten sharper with time, not duller. You know the prescription says 1 tablet is needed, and you know that as needed has expanded considerably in its definition over the past year. You know at some level that you don't examine closely that taking 2 a day is more than the doctor prescribed. You also know that 1 is no longer enough. The negotiation happens quickly because it always resolves the same way, and the pill is taken, and the afternoon softens again, and you sit in the chair for another 20 minutes before the washing machine beeps and you get up. The television helps. All My Children is on at 1. One Life to Live at 2. These are shows about people whose lives are dramatically, operatically worse than yours, and there is real comfort in this. In soap operas, everyone's husband has a secret. Everyone's family has a crisis. Marriages collapse and rebuild and collapse again with a frequency that makes the relatively stable misery of your own situation look almost serene. You follow these characters with the investment of someone tracking real people, because they are, in the hours of the afternoon, more present to you than most real people. They appear reliably. They're always there at 1 o'clock. In a life that offers very little that is reliably, comfortingly there, this counts for something. Let's talk about the television, because in a house where conversation has gone underground, the television fills the space. It is on for most of the day, not because you're watching it exactly, but because the sound of it makes the house feel less empty. The news at noon, the game shows, the soap operas, which you follow with an investment that surprises you. The children come home and take over the set entirely. Saturday morning cartoons, after-school reruns, the 3 channels cycling through their afternoon programming with a reliability that the rest of life cannot match. Prime time is family time, which means you sit together in the living room watching Columbo or the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and Mary Richards is single and has a career and an apartment in Minneapolis, and you watch her the way you'd watch someone from a lifeboat watching a cruise ship. The television in the 1970s is a piece of furniture. It is enormous and heavy and encased in a wood-panelled cabinet and sits in the living room like a god, which is more or less what it is. There are 3 channels. You choose from 3. This sounds impossibly limiting from the vantage point of a world in which there is more content than any human could watch in a lifetime. But there is something to be said for the shared cultural experience of having only 3 options. Everybody watched the same things. At the Wednesday coffee, you all know what happened on the same shows. It is a common language. Mary Tyler Moore is the one that gets to you. The show ran from 1970 to 1977, and it is, quietly, an act of revolution dressed as a sitcom. Mary Richards is 30 years old, unmarried by choice, living alone in Minneapolis, working as a television news producer, making her own decisions about her own life with a warmth and competence that is, somehow, not threatening to the network executives who greenlit it, possibly because it's also very funny. You watch Mary every week with a feeling that you cannot entirely name. It is not envy, exactly. Envy would require you to know what you wanted instead. And the question of what you want instead is one you've become very practiced at not finishing. It is more like recognition of a road not taken. Mary's life is not perfect, but it is hers, in a way that feels different from anything you've been given a map for. The children watch television in a way that constitutes, functionally, your 3rd childcare arrangement after yourself and the school. After 3:15, the television babysits. You do not feel guilty about this in the way that contemporary parenting culture would require you to feel guilty, because contemporary parenting culture has not happened yet. The children watch cartoons. The cartoons are violent in a cheerful, consequence-free way, anvils dropped on heads, cliffs run off of, everything exploding and then reassembling. Nobody has yet commissioned the research suggesting this might not be ideal. The children are sitting down, they are quiet, and you are making dinner. This is the best available arrangement, and you're all fine with it. Prime time brings the family together in the living room, which sounds like warmth, and is warmth, of a specific 1970s variety. You sit in your respective chairs, the husband in the armchair, you on the couch, children arranged on the floor on their stomachs. Nobody is talking. Everybody is watching the same screen. There is, in this, a kind of togetherness that is real, and also almost entirely passive. You're not connecting. You're coexisting in front of the same light source, which is its own form of companionship and should not be dismissed. It is just not the same thing as being known by the people you live with. But at 9 o'clock the children are in bed, and the husband has fallen asleep in the armchair, and you sit alone in the blue television light for one last hour, and the house is finally completely quiet, and the day is almost done. Let's talk about what was actually happening medically, because the soft warmth of a Quaalude was not free. The drug worked by depressing the central nervous system, slowing everything down, softening anxiety, reducing the body's alarm responses. It also caused drowsiness, slurred speech, poor coordination, and at higher doses, a state that could look, from the outside, remarkably like drunk. Long-term use brought tolerance, meaning you needed more to feel the same effect. It brought dependence, meaning stopping brought withdrawal, anxiety, insomnia, tremors, and in severe cases seizures. And it brought something subtler and harder to name, a gradual erosion of the capacity to feel things without the drug's mediation. The world, unfiltered, began to feel like a very loud room. The body's relationship with methaqualone evolved slowly and without announcement. In the beginning, the drug was simply effective. You took it, the system calmed, you functioned. Your hands stopped shaking at the kitchen sink. The low-grade dread that had made mornings feel like climbing a steep hill receded to something manageable. You slept. For a woman who had not been sleeping properly in years, sleep alone was enough to make the prescription feel like grace. The body responded well. You looked better, less drawn, less tight around the eyes. Your husband mentioned once that you seemed more relaxed. He meant it as a compliment, but the body adapts. That is its central skill, and in this context, its central betrayal. The GABA receptors in your brain, flooded daily with methaqualone's calming signal, began to down-regulate, producing fewer natural receptors, reducing the brain's own inhibitory capacity, essentially offloading the job to the drug. This process happened gradually over weeks and months, below the threshold of conscious awareness. What you noticed was not the mechanism but the effect. The pill was not working as well as it used to. The warmth was shorter, the edges came back sooner, and underneath the edges was something worse than what you'd started with. A raw, amplified anxiety that was not your original anxiety, but the nervous system's new baseline, recalibrated around the drug's presence. The physical side effects accumulated without obvious origin. The coordination was subtly off. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would announce itself as a symptom, just the occasional stumble, the glass set down harder than intended, the momentary blankness in the middle of a simple task. Your sleep, which the drug had initially improved, became complicated. Hours of heavy sedation followed by sudden, complete wakefulness at 2 a.m, the drug clearing from the system, and the rebound anxiety filling the space it left. You added a third pill, sometimes for the nights. The prescription was for 1. You'd started taking 2 during the day. The math of the bottle no longer matched the math of the prescription, and you managed this through the pharmacy 2 towns over, through occasional calls to the doctor describing insomnia, through a system of small recalibrations that had the quiet efficiency of something practiced. None of this felt like addiction, because the word addiction in 1973 belonged to a different kind of person in a different kind of life. The heroin addict, the Skid Row alcoholic, not the woman in the split level with the clean kitchen and the children at school. Addiction required, in the popular imagination, a moral failing, a character weakness, a choice made in the direction of destruction. You had not chosen anything like that. You had taken a prescribed medication as directed, and then slightly more than directed, because slightly more than directed was what the situation required. The distinction felt important. It was also medically irrelevant. Let's talk about silence, because one of the defining features of this life is how much of it is never spoken aloud. The pill habit is not discussed with the husband. It is not discussed with Carol from 3 doors down. It is certainly not discussed with the children, who are 7 and 5 and 2, and simply notice that sometimes Mum moves more slowly in the afternoons, and sometimes her words get a little soft at the edges. There is no language for this in 1973, not in the suburbs, not at the kitchen table, not at the PTA meeting. Addiction is something that happens to other people, in other neighbourhoods, to people who made bad choices. This is a prescription. This is a doctor's advice. This is just a little something to take the edge off. The secret has layers. The outermost layer is the one maintained for everyone. The neighbours, the school, the world beyond the front door. This layer is impeccable. The house is clean. You're dressed by the time anyone might see you. The children arrive at school on time, lunch is packed, permission slips signed. You show up to the things you're supposed to show up to. You smile in the right places. From outside the picture window, the life looks like itself. A family, a house, a woman managing it all with what appears to be competence, even ease. The second layer is the one maintained within the house, for the husband. He knows you take something for your nerves. He was there when you first got the prescription, and he was relieved, genuinely relieved, because you had not been sleeping, and you had been anxious, and the prescription seemed to fix both of those things, which meant one less thing for him to worry about. What he does not know is how the prescription has evolved. He has not counted the pills. He has not noticed the bottle being refilled ahead of schedule. He's not looking for evidence of a problem because the presenting evidence, the clean house, the ready dinner, the wife who seems, on balance, fine, suggests there is no problem. He takes the surface for the depth, which is its own kind of failure of attention, but it is also simply what happens when one person is not paying close enough attention to another person's interior life. The innermost layer of the secret is the one you keep from yourself. This is the most technically impressive part of the whole arrangement, the capacity to know, without knowing, that something is wrong. You know the pills are more than they used to be. You know the bottle runs out faster than it should. You know the feeling you have without the pill in the morning is not just how mornings feel, but is something the pill is causing by its absence. You know all of this the way you know that the car makes a sound it shouldn't, but you don't take it to the mechanic because taking it to the mechanic makes it real. The knowledge sits just below the surface of the day's activity, available if you go looking for it, never volunteering itself, never forcing a confrontation. This is the nature of secrets. They don't hide in the dark. They hide in plain sight, in plain daylight, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, quiet as the avocado green refrigerator hum. Let's talk about the marriage, the whole marriage, which means we have to talk about the bedroom. By 1973, many a suburban marriage has settled into a kind of affectionate management arrangement. 2 people running a household enterprise, occasionally sleeping in the same bed, periodically touching each other in ways that have lost most of the urgency they once contained. This is not unusual. This is in fact so statistically normal in the suburb that it is never discussed, because discussing it would require admitting it, and admitting it would require doing something about it, and doing something about it sounds exhausting. The Quaalude does not help with desire. The central nervous system is not where desire lives alone, and depressing it tends to depress everything. But it does help with caring about it less, which is a different kind of relief. You got married at 22, which felt like the right time in 1967, because 1967 had a fairly specific timeline for women, and 22 was squarely on it. You were in love, or something that felt enough like love to be functionally indistinguishable at the time. He was handsome and kind and had a job and wanted children, and those credentials were, in 1967, essentially the complete checklist. The early years were genuinely good, the particular aliveness of a new household, a new life, something being built. The first pregnancy, moving into the house, learning each other's rhythms in the specific intimate way of two people sharing a small space. But 6 years of marriage, 3 children, a split level, and approximately 10,000 consecutive evenings of dinner dishes, television, bed have their effect. Not a dramatic effect. Nothing breaks. The love is still present, in the way that a fire reduced to coals is still fire, warm, real, just not burning in a way that requires much attention. You are companions. You are co-parents. You are on certain Sunday afternoons when the children are somehow both quiet and occupied. Even friends. What you are not, with any frequency or intensity, is lovers. And neither of you has said this out loud because saying it would require a conversation neither of you is sure you want to have, about things neither of you is sure you want to know. The methaqualone, had the prescribing doctor thought to mention it, suppresses libido along with everything else the central nervous system governs. It is not a side effect that gets significant attention in the literature of this era, possibly because the literature of this era is not particularly interested in the sexual experience of middle-class suburban women, which is itself a statement. What you notice is not the pharmacological mechanism but the practical result. You care less than you used to, and caring less feels, from the inside, like a form of peace, because caring more had mostly produced a low, nagging unhappiness that nobody was doing anything about. The absence of desire when you have lived with unmet desire for long enough can feel like resolution. It is, medically, nothing of the sort. But the body keeps score in its own time and the bill has not arrived yet. Let's talk about the dinner party, because this is where the performance reaches its peak. Someone on the street is having people over, Saturday night 7:30, bring a bottle of wine and wear something nice. You spend the better part of Saturday cleaning a house that was already clean, cooking something that requires more steps than any dish has a right to require, getting the children bathed and into bed early with the kind of cheerful authority that leaves no room for negotiation. By 7 o'clock you're dressed, composed, lipsticked, and genuinely cannot remember if you've taken one pill today or two. The guests arrive, the wine is opened. You're the perfect hostess, warm, organised, funny. Nobody at this party has any idea how hard this afternoon was. The dinner party is a ritualised form of social performance that the suburb has elevated to something approaching art. Everyone is there. The Hendersons from next door, the Kowalskis from the end of the block, the couple who just moved in on Elm whose names you keep almost learning. The women have all put on their good dresses, the men have all put on their blazers. Everyone arrives with a bottle of wine and a willingness to be cheerful for 4 hours, which is the social contract of the dinner party in 1973, and it is, in its own way, a remarkable collective act of civilization. The kitchen is where the evening really lives. The women drift there between courses, because the kitchen is the room where the performance is allowed to briefly drop, where someone can sigh, where shoes can be half removed, where Carol can pour herself a second glass of wine with a look that says that was a thing I needed to do, and no further explanation is necessary. You move between the kitchen and the dining room with the smooth efficiency of someone who has done this many times, which you have, and who is genuinely happy to be doing it, which tonight you are, because the pills are at the right level, neither too many nor too few, and the warmth of them has blended with the wine in a way that makes the evening feel almost festive. The conversations follow familiar grooves. The men talk about work and sports and the price of everything. The women talk about the children and the neighbourhood and a television show that everyone watched this week. Nobody talks about politics, which is an agreement this particular group has reached after the unfortunate incident at the Kowalski party of last spring that everyone is still technically not mentioning. There is laughter, real laughter, the kind that arrives unexpectedly and catches everyone slightly off guard, and for an hour in the middle of the evening you are genuinely having a good time. This is real. The good time is real. The performance and the reality are not mutually exclusive. People are complicated that way. The guests leave at 11:30. The door closes. The kitchen, which you tidied between courses with the practiced invisibility of a professional, still needs its final pass. You wash the last of the dishes while your husband, already loosened by 2 glasses of wine and the pleasurable exhaustion of a social evening, sits in the living room and recaps the night at you from the other room in the way that people recap things at tired spouses. You make the appropriate sounds. The kitchen gets clean, the house goes quiet. You take the last pill of the day with a glass of water at the kitchen sink, looking out at the dark backyard, the neighbourhood silent, the whole suburb sleeping. You are wonderful tonight. You know this because everyone said so. You're also, underneath the wine and the pill and the glow of the evening, completely depleted in a way that has no word for it yet. Let's talk about what the children were learning, because children are learning everything, all the time, even when, especially when, no one is teaching them anything deliberately. They are learning that mothers are always in the kitchen. They are learning that fathers leave and come back and expect things to be ready. They are learning a particular family rhythm, the morning velocity, the afternoon softness, the evenings that depend entirely on how the day went. They do not have words for what they are observing. They are 7 and 5 and 2. But they are filing it away with the quiet efficiency that children have, building their model of what marriage is, what womanhood is, what normal looks like. They will carry this for a very long time. The 7-year-old is learning what women do. She's watching every day, with the attention that 7-year-olds bring to everything, total and unfiltered, before the social training that teaches us to look away from what makes us uncomfortable. She sees you cook and clean and drive and organise and manage. She sees you smile when you don't want to. She sees the way you adjust yourself when your husband walks in the door, the slight straightening, the shift from whatever you were in the kitchen to the wife version, welcoming, ready. She does not have a name for this adjustment, but she feels it. It registers in her the way a subtle change in air pressure registers, not consciously processed but physically felt. She is taking notes she doesn't know she's taking. They will come out later, in her own kitchen, in her own marriage, in the particular way she holds herself when she's tired but performing otherwise. The 5-year-old is learning what men do. He is 5, and he's already absorbing the shape of his father's life as the shape of a life. Dad goes, Mum stays. Dad sits in the chair. Mum brings the thing from the kitchen. Dad talks about his day. Mum asks the questions. He will not remember learning this. It will simply become, by the time he's grown, the texture of what he assumes is normal, which is how cultural inheritance works, quietly and completely, before anyone is old enough to question it. He is a sweet boy. He is not learning cruelty. He is learning a world, and the world he is learning is the one he lives in, which is the only world available to him. This is how it persists, generation to generation, not through malice, but through simple transmission. The 2-year-old is too young to understand anything and understands everything. Children at 2 are pure nervous system. They feel the emotional temperature of a room with an accuracy that embarrasses adults. She knows when you are tired. She knows when the afternoon has a different quality. She cannot say this because she is 2 and her vocabulary is roughly 40 words, but she senses it the way animals sense weather, and she responds to it. Clingier on the hard days, more demanding, louder in the particular way that is a 2-year-old's only instrument for communicating need. You pick her up, you hold her. She puts her face in your neck in the way that only very small children do, trustingly and completely. And whatever else is happening, this part, this specific warm weight in your arms, this small face against your shoulder, this is not complicated. This is the clearest thing in the day. What these children are absorbing will surface in ways that researchers studying this generation will spend decades untangling. The daughters of the 1970s housewife will go to therapy in the 1990s and talk about their mothers, the distance, the unreachability, the pills they found in the cabinet. They will do this not out of cruelty, but out of the same hunger every generation has to understand where it came from. And in those therapy offices and in those conversations, the 1970s housewife will finally be seen clearly, not as a failure, not as a victim, but as a woman doing the best she could inside a structure that was doing its level best to break her. It will not undo anything, but it will be understood. Let's talk about the appointment. It is on the third Thursday of every month, 9:15. The same doctor your husband plays golf with, the same man who delivered your second child. It takes about 8 minutes. He asks how you're sleeping. You say fine, mostly. He asks if the anxiety is better. You say, much better. Yes, thank you. He writes the prescription. You take it to the pharmacy 2 towns over because the pharmacist at the one closer to home has started giving you a look you don't care for. The new pharmacist doesn't know your name yet. This feels, for reasons you can't entirely articulate, like a small mercy. The waiting room is full of women. This is not a coincidence. Women in this era account for 2/3 of all prescriptions for psychoactive medications, tranquilizers, sleeping pills, sedatives. A 1972 report by the Senate Subcommittee on Monopoly will find that women are prescribed these drugs at rates dramatically exceeding men, not because women are more ill, but because the medical system has decided, broadly and without apparent discomfort, that the appropriate response to a woman's distress is sedation. The waiting room reflects this. You recognize 2 of the women from the neighborhood. You nod at each other. Nobody mentions why you're there. The doctor is a good diagnostician. He's thorough when thorough is required. When you came in with a respiratory infection 2 winters ago, he caught a secondary complication that another doctor might have missed. He cares about his patients in the genuine way of someone who chose medicine as a vocation rather than simply a profession. He does not, however, have the tools or the training or the cultural permission to see what is in front of him in your case, which is a woman whose dependence on her prescription has long since outpaced the prescription's therapeutic purpose. He asks the questions his training gave him. You answer with the script the situation requires. Neither of you is lying. Neither of you is telling the whole truth. What he does not ask, and what would change everything if he did, is, tell me what the day after you run out feels like. Because the day after you run out, which happens sometimes in the gap between appointments, when the timing doesn't work, is not simply an anxious day. It is a day of a different quality entirely. Heart pounding, skin crawling, a shaking in your hands that you control by gripping things. A sense of dread so pervasive it has no object, it simply is surrounding everything like weather. This is not your original anxiety. This is the nervous system in active withdrawal, the body protesting the absence of what it has been taught to expect. This symptom, precisely described, would change the conversation in the doctor's office completely. But you have learned, not consciously, not strategically, simply through the accumulated wisdom of a system in self-preservation, not to describe it. The prescription is written. You fold it, put it in your purse, in the inside pocket. You schedule the next appointment at the front desk. You walk to the car. You sit for a moment before starting the engine. The parking lot is full of other cars. The sun is doing something pleasant with the tree at the edge of the lot, the leaves just starting to turn. It is a beautiful morning, objectively. You notice it. You start the car. You drive 2 towns over to the pharmacy where nobody knows your name yet, and you hand over the prescription with the easy confidence of someone who does this every month, which you are, and you wait, and you take the white bag, and you drive home. And the day continues, and the appointment is already behind you, and the next one is exactly 4 weeks away. Let's talk about what was happening outside the house while you were inside it. Because 1973 is not a quiet moment in American women's history. Betty Friedan had already named, in 1963, the problem that has no name. The creeping, specific misery of the educated woman with nothing to do with her education. The National Organization for Women was organizing. Ms. Magazine launched in 1972. Roe v. Wade was decided in January of 73. Outside your picture window, a conversation was happening about women's lives that was the loudest it had ever been. And inside your house, behind the avocado appliances and the prescription bottle, it is entirely possible to feel like that conversation is happening in a language you were never taught to speak. The women's movement of the 1970s was a revolution, and like most revolutions, it had a particular centre of gravity that was not always where you lived. It was in the cities, it was in the universities, it was in the consciousness-raising groups where women sat in circles and said the unsayable things out loud for the first time, and discovered, with something between relief and fury, that the unsayable things were shared. You did not have a consciousness-raising group. You had the Wednesday coffee, which was its own form of collective female endurance, but ran on a different fuel entirely, on discretion rather than disclosure, on comfort rather than confrontation. The consciousness-raising group asked women to name their oppression. The Wednesday coffee asked them to have another slice of coffee cake. This is not a criticism of the Wednesday coffee. The Wednesday coffee was doing something real and important. But the women's movement, arriving in the suburb through television and magazines and the occasional overheard conversation, asked a set of questions that the suburb's social structure was not designed to accommodate. Questions like, why are women doing all of this unpaid labour? Why are women's mental health problems treated with sedatives rather than structural change? Why does a woman need her husband's signature to open a bank account, which was, extraordinarily, still the case in many states in 1973? These are not small questions. They are questions with large, uncomfortable answers that require the people benefiting from the current arrangement to give something up. And the suburb, which had organised itself entirely around the current arrangement, received these questions with a particular anxiety of a place that recognises, at some level, that they are legitimate. You have opinions about the women's movement that you have not shared with anyone, including your husband, especially your husband. You think Gloria Steinem is right about more things than is comfortable to admit while standing in your Harvest Gold kitchen. You think Betty Friedan described something real? You recognised it. Reading the feminine mystique at your mother's kitchen table in 1965, recognised it with the specific alarm of seeing your own face somewhere you didn't expect it. You did not do anything with the recognition. You got married the following year. But the recognition stayed, filed away with the other things that have no action attached to them, waiting. What the women's movement offered, from the vantage point of the suburb, was a mirror and a door. The mirror showed the structure clearly, named it, measured it, refused the comforting explanation that women's unhappiness was a personal failing rather than a systemic product. The door pointed towards something else: education, employment, legal equality, reproductive autonomy, a life that had more architecture than the one available. What it did not fully reckon with in these early years was how hard it was to walk through a door when you had 3 children, no income of your own, no recent work history, a mortgage in your husband's name, and a prescription bottle behind the good china that you were not entirely sure you could stop taking. Liberation is a complicated proposition when your nervous system has been chemically retrained to require a substance just to feel like itself. The movement knocked on the window. You heard it. You were not in 1973 in a position to answer, but you heard it. Let's talk about the path not taken, because she existed. In another version of this life, there was college. Maybe there was a degree, or part of one, or at least the plan for one before the wedding made it feel less urgent. There was something she was good at. Teaching, maybe, or bookkeeping. Or she had a real gift for the organisational logic that makes institutions run, which is exactly what she has been doing for free at home for the last decade. The labour is real, the competence is undeniable, but in 1973 the route from here back to there, back to working, back to a salary, back to an identity that doesn't dissolve into the household, is not obvious and not supported and not, in this particular suburb, considered entirely respectable. You went to college for 2 years. This is more than many women your age, though less than you'd planned, because the plan changed when he proposed, and the proposal seemed like the logical next step, and in 1967, for a woman in your circumstances, it was. You studied English literature. You were good at it, genuinely good, the kind of good where your professor wrote comments in the margins of your papers that were longer than the usual brief approval stamp, that engaged with your ideas rather than simply marking them correct. You like the feeling of a good argument made well on paper. You like the logic of it, the precision, the way language could do something if you arranged it properly. You have not arranged language for anything other than a grocery list in 6 years. The competence didn't vanish. This is the thing about skills. They go underground, but they don't disappear. You can see it in the way you manage the household, the budgeting, the scheduling, the logistics of moving 3 children through a week of overlapping activities without collision, the management of your husband's social calendar and your own, and the children's and the house's maintenance schedule, and the grocery inventory and the finances. This is project management. This is operations. In a corporate context, this skill set would have a salary attached. In your current context, it has a casserole attached, which is not the same thing, financially or psychologically. The employment landscape for women in 1973 is changing, but has not yet changed enough. Married women can still be denied credit in their own name in many states. Help-wanted ads in newspapers are still divided into male and female columns, a practice that will not be ruled discriminatory until 1973, the same year you are living in, which means it is changing today, technically, while simultaneously being entirely intact in practice. The jobs available to women without recent work history and with childcare obligations are not the jobs that use the skills you have. They are typing pools and secretarial positions and part-time retail, which you could do and which would provide some income and some identity outside the house, but which also require the childcare you cannot currently afford on a part-time retail salary. The math doesn't work. The system is designed for the math not to work, which is either a conspiracy or a coincidence so consistent it amounts to the same thing. What lives inside you, underneath the casserole and the carpool and the prescription that keeps the days manageable, is a very particular kind of grief, not for something you lost exactly, but for something that never fully arrived. The woman who was going to do something with the intelligence she demonstrably had, she is still in here. She reads the books when she can find the time. She follows the news. She has opinions about things that have nothing to do with what to make for dinner. She's not gone. She's just in the wrong building. And in 1973, with 3 children and a mortgage and a nervous system chemically dependent on a scheduled substance, there is no clear map from here to somewhere else. So she stays. And she makes the casserole, and she is good at it, and that is both the consolation and the loss. Let's talk about the nights when it all comes apart a little. The Quaalude was prescribed in part as a sleep aid, and in the beginning it worked. Sleep came easily, heavily, like a curtain falling. But over time, as tolerance built, the sleep became complicated. Vivid, dreams, sudden wakefulness at 2 a.m, the house completely still, every anxiety that the pill softened during the day standing at the foot of the bed at full volume. The husband asleep beside you, breathing with the deep regularity of someone who does not lie awake wondering if this is all there is. You stare at the ceiling. The ceiling of the 1970s split level is a popcorn texture, little bumps in the plaster like frozen ocean. You count them for a while, then you stop. The 2 a.m. wakefulness has its own quality, distinct from daytime anxiety and from the particular exhaustion of the early evening. It is very clear. That is the disorienting part. The pills, the fatigue, the blur of the day fall away, and what's left is the mind running at full clarity in a dark house at 2 a.m, with no tasks to perform and no distractions available, just the thoughts in their raw form, unmediated. The mortgage, the 5-year-old slight speech delay that the teacher mentioned in October and that you've been managing your worry about ever since. The prescription running low, it runs low earlier each month, and the next appointment is still 11 days away. Your mother, aging in her house an hour away, alone since your father died. All of it, arriving at once at full volume while the house sleeps. You have developed strategies for the 2 a.m. wakefulness the way you develop strategies for everything, methodically, practically, alone. Sometimes you get up and go to the kitchen and make a cup of tea that you don't really want, because the ritual of making it is something to do, and doing something is better than lying in the dark doing nothing. You sit at the kitchen table in the blue-grey dark of the kitchen at 2 a.m, the house smelling of dinner and children and the particular smell of a house that is lived in hard, and you drink the tea and you wait for the thoughts to slow, for the clock to reach a number that feels more reasonable, for the chemical tide in your nervous system to turn back toward something workable. Sometimes, on the very bad nights, you take another pill. You know you should not. The prescription is for 1 a day, and you're already taking 2, and a third is a number you're not comfortable naming even to yourself. But the 2 a.m. arithmetic is different from the daytime arithmetic. At 2 a.m, with the anxiety at full volume and sleep completely unavailable and work beginning again in 4 hours, the cost-benefit calculation of another pill resolves very quickly and in one direction. You take it. The edges soften. Sleep returns, eventually heavy and dreamless, not restoring exactly, but sufficient. In the morning, the alarm goes off. The husband showers. The children need breakfast. The day begins. And what happened at 2 a.m. gets folded away with the other things that don't get examined in daylight, and the routine absorbs it without a mark. What you do not know, what nobody has told you, because nobody in 1973 is telling women this specifically, is that the 2 a.m. wakefulness is not your original insomnia returning. It is a methaqualone rebound effect, the drug metabolizing completely, the nervous system snapping back to its now elevated baseline state of alertness, the GABA system flooded earlier in the day now running dry. The anxiety of the 2 a.m. hours is partly chemical, a withdrawal effect measured in hours rather than days, which means taking another pill is not addressing the anxiety. It is postponing its next arrival. The ceiling gets counted again tomorrow night. The nights are getting worse, not better, and there is a connection between the medication and the sleeplessness that the prescription bottle does not mention, and the doctor has not explained, and that you will not learn about for years when someone finally uses the right words in the right order in your presence, and the whole picture assembles itself with the horrible clarity of something that should have been obvious much sooner. Let's talk about the afternoon the neighbour noticed. It was nothing dramatic. This is not a dramatic story, not yet. It was a Tuesday, and Carol from 3 doors down stopped by without calling ahead, the way people did then, and found you at the kitchen table in a way that was hard to define exactly. Not asleep, not crying. Just very still, in a way that wasn't quite right, the way a room is very still when something has recently happened in it. Carol made coffee. You said you were just tired. The kids had been a handful. You hadn't slept well. Carol said, "Of course, you poor thing." She stayed for 40 minutes and watched you very carefully, and when she left, she did not bring it up again. Because in 1973, in this suburb, there was no script for what came next. The stillness Carol found you in had a name that nobody was using. It was sedation, not sleep, but the body under the influence of a central nervous system depressant at a level that had begun to exceed what the daily schedule could accommodate. The dose that had been adequate 6 months ago was now insufficient for its intended effect. The dose that was now adequate for the intended effect was, on some afternoons, more than a functioning adult could metabolize and still be fully present in a kitchen at 3:15 in the afternoon. The arithmetic of tolerance and dependence had finally produced a visible result. You'd been managing it very well for a very long time. Tuesday afternoon, it showed. The specific effects of methaqualone at higher doses are worth naming clearly because they explain the Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen. Slurred speech, impaired short-term memory, reduced reaction time, muscle relaxation so complete that fine motor tasks become unreliable, a profound calm that is indistinguishable from blankness to anyone watching from outside. These are not recreational effects. They are the drug doing exactly what it is designed to do, suppressing the central nervous system at a level that has now exceeded the therapeutic range and entered something more accurately described as intoxication. You did not feel intoxicated. You felt from the inside approximately normal. This discrepancy between how you felt and how you appeared is one of the cruelest features of sedative dependence. The internal experience becomes so normalized that the external evidence is invisible to the person it belongs to. The slipping has been gradual enough that you have not registered it as slipping. Gradual is how these things work, not a cliff but a slope, barely perceptible at each step, only visible when you look back at how far you've descended. The coordination has been off for months, small things, nothing dramatic. The glass set down slightly too hard, the step misjudged on the back porch stairs, the word that arrives a beat later than intended. The memory has gaps, small ones, not enough to notice unless you're paying attention, which requires a kind of observation of yourself that the day's logistics do not leave much room for. You are too busy managing the life to notice that the life has begun managing you. Carol goes home and says nothing. To you, to her husband, to anyone on the street. She files it somewhere private and keeps the Wednesday coffees going, with the same cheerful consistency as always. But something has shifted in the way she looks at you, not unkindly. Nothing so direct as concern, just a quality of attention that was not there before. The specific attention of a friend who has seen something and doesn't know what to do with it. This is what the 1970s suburb offered the women inside it. The warmth of proximity and the complete absence of tools. Carol cares. Carol has no idea what to say. The two things coexist, and the Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen gets folded into the silence that holds all the other things nobody is saying, and the week continues and dinner is ready at 6 and the performance goes on. Let's talk about the conversation that almost happened. He noticed one evening that dinner was on the table but you were in the bedroom lying down, and when he came to find you, your words came out in the wrong order. He sat on the edge of the bed. He asked if you were all right. You said you were just tired. He said you seemed more than tired. There was a silence, the kind that has the whole conversation sitting inside it, waiting. And then the youngest started crying from the other room, and he went to get her, and by the time dinner was cleared and the children were in bed, the moment had passed the way these moments do, not with a resolution, but with a quiet agreement to let it go, because looking at it directly would require a language neither of you was quite sure you had. Your husband is not an unobservant man. He is, in many ways, a perceptive one. He reads people well in professional settings, navigates office politics with the ease of someone who pays attention. What he is not particularly skilled at is observing his wife, which is a specific and common failure that has less to do with his individual character than with the fact that no one taught him to look. The domestic sphere was her territory. He entered it at 6 and left it at 8, and in between he was a guest, a welcomed and permanent guest, but a guest, and guests do not typically audit the household. He noticed the dinner. He didn't notice the 7 steps it took to produce the dinner, or the state of the person who produced them. But on this particular evening, the evidence was beyond the usual threshold. You were in the bedroom at 6:15, which was outside the pattern. Your speech was off in a way that couldn't be explained by tiredness alone. He had seen you tired, had lived with you tired for years, and this was different, softer, slower, with a quality he couldn't name but registered somewhere below the level of conscious analysis. He sat on the bed and he asked the questions he had available, which were simple questions, the kind that a person asks when they don't yet have the vocabulary for the more complicated question underneath. Are you all right? Are you sick? Can I get you something? He was trying, with the tools he had, which were not the right tools but were what he had. And then the 2-year-old cried, and he went. And this is the 1970s marriage in one clean image. The moment of potential clarity interrupted by a child, and both parents returning to their roles, because the roles are what hold the structure up and the structure cannot be examined while it is simultaneously being maintained. The dinner gets cleared. The children go to bed. He falls asleep in the armchair. You wash the last of the dishes and take the final pill of the day, and stand at the kitchen sink looking out at the dark backyard, and the conversation that almost happened dissolves into the ordinary texture of the evening without leaving a visible mark. The mark is there, it just isn't visible yet. It will be, eventually. These conversations always resurface, because the thing producing them doesn't stop just because the conversation does. But not tonight. Tonight, the house is quiet. Tonight, it was a suff to get through. Let's talk about the pharmacy, because the pharmacy is where the whole architecture of this arrangement becomes most visible if anyone were paying attention, which they mostly aren't. You walk in on a Thursday afternoon, you hand over the prescription. The pharmacist, new one, doesn't know you, fills it with the brisk efficiency of someone filling one of 100 prescriptions that day. You pay. You put the bottle in your purse, in the inside pocket, not the main compartment. You walk back to the station wagon. You sit in the parking lot for a moment before starting the car outside the windshield, a strip mall in a suburb in 1973, a dry cleaner, a pizza place, a card shop. Perfectly ordinary. Nobody watching. You start the car. The pharmacy 2 towns over is a 10-minute drive on a good day, 15 with traffic, and you've been making this drive once a month for long enough that it has its own groove in the schedule, its own set of associated feelings. There is a particular turning of the stomach that happens when the bottle gets low, a low-grade alertness, not quite anxiety but adjacent to it, a monitoring of the supply against the timeline with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned to manage a resource carefully. The appointment is on the 3rd Thursday. The prescription is for 30 pills. The bottle runs out around the 26th day, sometimes the 25th. This discrepancy, never fully resolved, requires the pharmacy 2 towns over. You have, in the past 18 months, developed a small and methodical system for managing the gap between what the prescription provides and what your daily requirement has become. The doctor prescribes 30 pills monthly. You supplement with a second prescription from a second doctor, a physician you found through a friend of a friend arrangement, a man who runs a busy practice and asks fewer questions than your regular doctor, whose waiting room is full of people who need something and know exactly how to ask for it. This is not technically legal in the way that legal is understood to apply to scheduled substances. You have not thought about it in those terms. You have thought about it in the terms available to a woman managing a resource. There was not enough of what you needed. and you found more of what you needed, and the system is now balanced. That is the entirety of the moral arithmetic. On the days when you perform moral arithmetic at all, which are not every day. The pharmacist at the store 2 towns over has a face that reveals nothing, which is precisely what you need in a pharmacist. He takes the prescription. He fills it. He asks if you have any questions about your medication. You say no, thank you. He slides the bag across the counter. The transaction takes 4 minutes and produces nothing that looks from the outside like anything other than a woman picking up a prescription on a Thursday afternoon, which is what it is technically, and also something considerably more complicated than that. The bottle goes in the inside pocket of your purse. You walk back to the station wagon. The strip mall offers nothing of note in either direction. You start the car. You drive home on the route that avoids your regular street, which is a habit that developed without you deciding to develop it. One of the small adjustments the system makes for itself when no one is watching. Let's talk about the moment the stakes became undeniable, because there was always going to be one. Not necessarily a single catastrophic event, though sometimes it was, but a moment when the management system that had kept everything looking fine failed visibly enough that even the people inside the arrangement could not pretend otherwise. Maybe it was a minor fender bender in a parking lot that she had no clear memory of afterward. Maybe it was the morning she forgot to pick up the children from school, and the school called and the husband answered. Maybe it was a fall, nothing serious, a bruise on the hip, but the circumstances were wrong, the hour was wrong, the explanation didn't quite add up. Something happened that made the invisible visible, and once you'd seen it, you couldn't unsee it. The school call is the version that lands hardest, not because it is the most dangerous, but because it is the most public. You were at home. The children were at school until 3:15. You know this. You have known this every day for 3 years. On this particular Tuesday at 3:45, the school calls to ask if someone is coming to pick up. You have no memory of the afternoon, not the specific gone-missing quality of a forgotten appointment, but the wrong kind of blankness, the kind produced not by distraction, but by sedation deep enough to have consumed the 3 o'clock hour entirely. Your husband answers. You hear his voice from the bedroom change register. He comes in. He asks quietly, what happened? You don't have an answer that makes sense, which is itself an answer of a kind. The car incident happens separately, 3 weeks later or 3 weeks before. The sequence is difficult to reconstruct with certainty, which is part of the problem. A minor rear end in the parking lot of the grocery store. You are moving slowly, barely moving, and the bump barely registers as anything other than embarrassment. Except you're not entirely sure how it happened. You remember pulling into the parking lot. You remember walking toward the store entrance. You do not have a clear memory of the few seconds in between. The other driver is annoyed but uninjured. You exchange insurance information. Your hands are steadier than your interior. Nobody calls the police. You drive home, park in the driveway, sit in the car for a long time before going inside. The fall is the quietest of the three. No witnesses. The back porch steps at dusk, the light already low, your coordination not what it should be at 6 in the evening, and then the step is not where you expected it, and the hip catches the corner of the wooden step, and it is not a serious fall in any medical sense. Bruising, nothing broken, nothing requiring intervention. But you sit on the porch steps for a moment, in the gathering dark, and something is different about this moment from all the previous moments of managed not quite rightness. Something has clarified, not into panic, not into crisis, into a very quiet, very clear sentence, the kind that forms itself without invitation in the mind at certain specific moments of genuine reckoning. This cannot keep going. You sit on the steps until the cold comes up through the wood beneath you. Then you go inside. Then the children need baths and dinner needs clearing, and the evening proceeds as evenings do, but the sentence stays. It does not go back wherever it came from. Let's talk about what happened next, because what happened next in 1973 looked very different from what it looks like today. There were no treatment centres advertising on television. There was no established cultural understanding of prescription drug addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failure. There was no HSA coverage for a residential program, no pamphlets at the paediatrician's office, no hotline. What there was, for women in suburbs, was usually one of three things: a husband who handled it privately, a doctor who reduced the prescription and offered a different prescription or nothing at all. A quiet reorganisation of the household around the problem, the way you reorganise. Furniture around a piece that doesn't quite fit, working around it, accommodating it, hoping it would eventually feel normal. The husband, if he finally engaged with what was in front of him, typically engaged with it in the only framework available, as a problem to be solved privately, within the family, without external involvement. The external involvement, a hospital, a program, any kind of structured treatment, implied a public acknowledgement of the situation that felt, in the social economy of the suburb, like an unacceptable cost. The neighbours would know, the school would hear, the doctor played golf with his friends and the conversation at the club would change its texture permanently. The handling was private. What private handling looked like in practice was a conversation, serious and uncomfortable, in which words like cutting back and getting a hold of this were used. A lock on the cabinet, a decision that you would see the doctor together for the next appointment. Careful, fragile reorganisation of the daily routine that addressed the symptoms without examining the root. The doctor presented with the fuller picture, more pills than prescribed. The car, the school call had several available responses, and most of them were pharmaceutical. There was a new drug, diazepam, sold as Valium, already the most prescribed drug in the country by 1973, positioned as the modern, safer, more precisely dosed successor to the older sedatives. Transitioning a patient from methaqualone to Valium was a common clinical move in this period, a move that addressed the presenting problem, the Quaalude dependence, with a solution that was pharmacologically in the same family as the problem. The logic was that Valium was more controllable, the dosing more predictable, the risk of the dramatic sedation effects lower. This is true in clinical terms. What is also true is that benzodiazepine dependence is its own chronic condition with its own withdrawal profile and its own long-term consequences, and prescribing one sedative to solve the problems of another sedative is a strategy with some important limitations that would not be fully acknowledged for another decade. What genuine help would have looked like, what it would eventually come to look like, for women who went through this experience and survived into an era with better tools, involved first naming the problem accurately. Prescription drug dependence, not nervousness, not fragile nerves, not a woman who needed to cope better. A physical dependence produced by a specific drug, requiring a medically supervised taper, combined with something to address the circumstances that had made the drug feel necessary in the first place. Therapy, real therapy, not a sympathetic nod from a doctor who had 11 minutes and a prescription pad. Space to say the things that had been going unsaid since the first Wednesday coffee, since the first morning the pill was taken behind, the good china. What happened next, in 1973, fell short of this in almost every case. But something had changed. The problem had a shape now, and problems with shapes can eventually be addressed. That, in 1973, was enough to be going on with. Let's talk about what happened to the drug itself, because the Quaaludes' time was limited. By the late 1970s, the evidence was accumulating, not just about addiction, which had always been there for anyone who looked, but about misuse, overdose, and the drug's particular association with a growing crisis of sexual assault. The DEA added it to the Schedule II list in 1973, restricting prescriptions. By 1984, it was a Schedule I controlled substance, effectively illegal. The doctors who'd been signing those prescriptions, many of them, simply moved on to the next available sedative. Valium, already enormously popular, became even more so the pharmaceutical. Treadmill kept moving. The housewife kept running. The regulatory tightening on methaqualone happened gradually and then, from the late 1970s onward, quickly. The drug's recreational use, it had acquired a significant street life, sold under names like Lemon 714 and suppos at parties and concerts, sometimes in combination with wine in an arrangement called luding out, had attracted the attention of law enforcement and the press in ways that its quiet domestic prescription life had not. The narrative that emerged publicly was primarily about recreational abuse, about young people at parties, about college campuses, about a drug associated with excess and recklessness. The housewife's story was largely not told in this public accounting. The woman who had been taking it daily for 4 years on the advice of her doctor was not the face the media chose for the Quaalude story. She was invisible in the crisis about her own medication, which is, if you think about it, entirely consistent with her experience throughout. The shift to Valium was not, for women in this situation, an exit from the problem. It was a change of vehicle. Benzodiazepines are effective medications with legitimate therapeutic applications, and in the decades since the 1970s they have also produced widespread dependence in exactly the same population. Women, prescribed by doctors for anxiety, for sleep, for the general management of lives too hard to live comfortably without chemical assistance. The Senate would hold hearings in 1979 on the overprescription of minor tranquilizers to women. Senator Edward Kennedy would call Valium the opium of the masses. The phrase was sharp and the hearings were real, and the change they produced was modest and slow. What did change in the decade following the 1970s was the cultural vocabulary. Women began to name things. The consciousness-raising groups of the early 70s had given way to a broader, more public conversation, and by the 1980s, prescription drug dependency was a phrase that could be said out loud in polite company, at least in some circles. The Betty Ford Center opened in 1982, and the First Lady's public acknowledgement of her own prescription drug and alcohol dependence was a cultural moment of genuine significance, not because it solved anything, but because it attached a legible face to an experience that millions of women had been living invisibly. The face was respectable, sympathetic, entirely without the moral condemnation that addiction had always brought. It was a beginning. It was inadequate to the scale of the problem. It was what was available. Let's talk about what this all adds up to, because history has a way of turning individual lives into data points, and the data points from this era are significant. Millions of women were prescribed sedative medications in the 1960s and 70s, not because they were weak, not because they were failures, but because they were living inside a structure that was making them genuinely, documentably unwell, and the response of the medical establishment was to treat the symptom rather than examine the structure. These women are the reason the conversation about mental health and gender exists in the form it does today. They are the reason prescription oversight looks different now. They are the reason we have the vocabulary, burnout, invisible labour, the mental load that we didn't have then. They didn't have the words. They had a diagnosis that blamed their nervous systems. They deserved better. The 1970s suburban housewife story is not a story about foolishness or weakness. This is important to say clearly because the instinct, looking back, is to wonder why she didn't see it coming, why she kept taking the pills, why she didn't say something, leave something, change something. The question contains its own answer, because the structure she was living inside actively prevented the seeing, the stopping, and the saying. The doctor didn't tell her the truth about the drug. The culture didn't give her the vocabulary for her own experience. The marriage didn't offer her economic independence, or an exit that didn't require abandoning her children. The prescription made the intolerable tolerable, and the intolerable was the only life available to her, and what was she supposed to do? Simply decide to feel it all, without assistance, while simultaneously making 3 meals a day and driving the carpool and smiling at the neighbour. The structural trap was real. It had walls. What she left behind, this woman in the Harvest Gold kitchen, is a blueprint for what not to do and what to do instead, both medically and socially. The generations of researchers and physicians who studied the pattern of her era produced informed consent requirements, prescription monitoring programs, gender-specific drug research that had previously been conducted almost entirely on male subjects, and clinical guidelines for recognizing and treating prescription drug dependence that did not exist when she was handed her first bottle. She left behind daughters who went to therapy and named the thing that had no name in her kitchen, who organized their lives differently, who insisted on being known inside their marriages in ways she never was. She left behind a conversation that is still going, about unpaid labor, about the medicalization of women's distress, about the gap between the life that is available and the life that the available should look like. She also left behind something smaller and more personal, the thing that gets lost in the data points, the specific texture of her life, the Wednesday coffees, the way she made a casserole every night for 6 years without anyone noticing the effort, the way she held the 2-year-old in the afternoon with a love so complete it required no qualification, the way she read in the parking lot, the magazine hidden inside another magazine, the ideas knocking at the window while she sat in the station wagon with the engine running. She was real, and she was complicated, and she was doing the best she could with what she had, in a time that offered her very little and expected everything. The history books, when they talk about the 1970s, talk about Watergate and the oil crisis and the end of Vietnam. She's in the footnotes, if she appears at all. But she was the centre of something, a household, a family, a life. And that centre held, however imperfectly, however chemically assisted, for longer than anyone had a right to expect. That is not a small thing. That is in fact a very large thing that went unseen for a very long time. It is being seen now. And so, here we are, at the end of a Tuesday in 1973. The children are in bed, the kitchen is clean, the casserole pan has been washed and dried and put away, the Harvest Gold carpet has been vacuumed. The permission slips are signed. The station wagon is in the driveway. The prescription bottle is behind the good china, a little lighter than it was this morning. The house is quiet. She did it. She got through the day, the lunches and the school run and the cleaning and the carpool and the cooking and the performance of the dinner party and the 2 a.m. ceiling counting and all the rest of it. She did it without anyone asking if she needed help, without anyone naming what was happening, without a single person in her life having the vocabulary to say, "I see you. I see how hard this is. I see that something is wrong, and that the something wrong is not you." She was not weak. She was not foolish. She was a woman living inside a structure that had been designed, with remarkable thoroughness, to make her invisible, to herself, to her husband, to her doctor, to the culture around her. The pill was not a character flaw. It was a response, a completely human and completely understandable response to a set of circumstances that had been declared normal when they were in fact a sustained emergency. She was lonely inside a full house. She was exhausted inside a life that didn't count exhaustion as a cost. She was capable of more than she was permitted to do, and she managed the gap with what was available to her, and what was available to her was a brown prescription bottle and a doctor who asked the wrong questions and a suburb that rewarded silence. But she was also, and this matters, this is the part that gets lost in the data so much more than the pill. She was the Wednesday coffees and the notes in the lunch bags on the good mornings. She was the hand on the 2-year-old's back in the dark at 3 a.m. when the nightmares came. She was the woman who read Ms. Magazine in the parking lot. The ideas knocking at the window, the door not yet open but not entirely closed either. She was stubborn and funny and capable and present in the ways that the life allowed her to be present and quietly, persistently herself in the ways it didn't. She held the whole thing together. Nobody noticed. She noticed. So tonight, as you pull your clean blanket up in your heated house, with your phone on the nightstand and your medication managed by a doctor who asks rather more questions than hers did, maybe spare a quiet thought for her. For the generation of women who kept the lights on and the children fed and the houses running while the culture debated whether their unhappiness was even real. It was real. It was always real. They just didn't have anyone to tell. History is full of people who did enormous things that nobody recorded. She is one of them. The Harvest Gold carpet is gone now. The avocado appliances are gone. The split level has been renovated twice since she lived in it. But the conversation she couldn't have, the one that sat inside every Wednesday coffee and every 2 a.m. ceiling count and every parking, Lot Magazine, that conversation is still going. We are still having it. She started it without knowing she did, simply by living it. Rest now. The day is done. The house is quiet. She got through it. So did you.